Welcome to Fractured Chaos.
Let me tell you about survival. Not the kind you read about in self-help books. The kind that carves itself into your DNA, that transforms your very ability to connect into a weapon of self-preservation. Attachment is a prison, and I've been its most skilled escape artist. Before I begin, understand this isn't a confession. It's an autopsy of a life spent mastering emotional detachment. A clinical examination of how I turned human connection into a science experiment. My mother, she wasn't cruel, she was worse. She was absent, not physically, emotionally. Love in my household was a transaction, a cold, calculated exchange of minimal affection for maximum compliance. I remember the Christmas I turned 7. I'd created a handmade card, spent hours on it. When I presented it, her eyes barely registered its existence. "That's nice, Adrian," she said, her attention already returning to her planner. She didn't hang it up. It disappeared by evening. That night, I learned to measure my efforts against their potential return. Emotional investment became a calculated risk assessment. My father worked 60-hour weeks at the firm. When home, he existed in a perpetual state of distraction. He'd nod at appropriate intervals during conversation, eyes never leaving his documents. I became an expert at crafting statements that required no response. Complete thoughts that demanded nothing, expected nothing. Our house was immaculate. Glass surfaces that showed every fingerprint, white carpets that betrayed every footstep. Nothing out of place, including emotions. I learned early that emotions are vulnerabilities. Feelings are wounds waiting to be infected. By age 10, I could read a room better than most adults could read a book. Every gesture, every micro-expression was a potential threat. My mother's slight jaw clench meant retreat was necessary. My father's particular sigh pattern indicated the precise amount of space to maintain. The day my father left, my mother didn't cry. She reorganized the furniture, erased his existence like a data entry error. That was my first lesson in emotional survival. Deletion is cleaner than mourning. That night, I heard her in the kitchen, not crying, methodically washing dishes at 2 a.m., scrubbing with such precision that I understood anger could be channeled into perfection. I stood in the doorway, watching her stainless steel performance of composure. She felt my presence but didn't acknowledge it. "Set the table for 2 tomorrow," she finally said without turning. No mention of him, no acknowledgement of change, just a practical adjustment to new circumstances. I nodded, though she couldn't see it. We never spoke of him again. His name became an architectural void we built our new life around. I learned that pain doesn't need acknowledgement to exist. It simply becomes the foundation upon which everything else is constructed. Middle school became my first controlled environment for social experimentation. I crafted different personas for different peer groups. With athletes, I developed precise knowledge of sports statistics. With academic achievers, I calibrated my intelligence to be impressive but not threatening. I didn't have friends, I had research subjects. Matthew Keller invited me to my first party in 8th grade. His parents were away. The house was filled with awkward teenagers pretending to understand freedom. I observed from corners, cataloging behavioral patterns, noting how alcohol modified social dynamics. Jessica Chen approached me, offered a drink. "You always watching everyone?" she asked. "I find people interesting," I replied, calibrating my smile to suggest mysterious depth rather than clinical observation. "You're weird," she said, but she stayed. Talked. I noted how vulnerability functioned as social currency when she shared her parents' divorce story. I reciprocated with a carefully selected, minimally revealing detail about my father's departure. Her eyes softened. Connection established. I walked her home that night. When she leaned in to kiss me, I permitted it, noting my physiological responses: increased heart rate, pupil dilation, standard biological reactions to intimacy. The kiss itself was a data point, nothing more. High school wasn't about friendship. It was a psychological playground. I became a master of adaptation, the charming athlete, the sensitive intellectual, the mysterious loner. Each mask was a carefully constructed defense mechanism. I didn't make friends. I conducted experiments in human attachment. By senior year, I understood that people weren't complex. They were predictable. They wanted to be seen, to be understood. I became proficient at creating the illusion of both. I could make anyone feel like the protagonist in my world, while keeping them firmly in the periphery of my reality. Mrs. Abernathy, my AP psychology teacher, was the first to notice. After class one day, she held me back. "Your paper on attachment theory was disturbing," she said, sliding my essay across her desk. "How so?" I kept my face neutral, interested. "You wrote about emotional bonds as if they were mathematical equations to be solved," she said. "As if human connection were simply a series of inputs and outputs." I recalibrated my expression to reflect thoughtful consideration. Isn't that essentially what psychology attempts to do? Quantify the unquantifiable? She studied me for a long moment. There's a difference between understanding human behavior and reducing it to mechanical processes. She leaned forward. "Adrian, connections aren't puzzles to solve. They're experiences to feel." I nodded as if receiving profound wisdom, while internally cataloging her as another adult operating on comfortable self-deception. Emotions weren't experiences, they were vulnerabilities to be managed, controlled, or better yet, weaponized. Sarah Thompson. My first true psychological deconstruction. She thought we were in love. In reality, she was a case study in emotional manipulation. We met in freshman year of college. Psychology 101. She sat 2 rows ahead, always asking questions that revealed her insecurities. Seeking validation through academic performance. Classic compensation mechanism. I knew precisely how to make her fall. Compliments engineered with surgical precision. Emotional withdrawal designed to create an addiction to my intermittent validation. When she was completely devoted, I disappeared. No explanation, no closure. The methodology was simple. First phase, consistent positive reinforcement. I noticed details others missed. The Sylvia Plath quote tattooed on her wrist, the way she twirled her hair when thinking. I mirrored her speech patterns, creating subconscious familiarity. Second phase, intermittent reinforcement. A canceled date, a delayed text response, then intense reconnection. The unpredictability created dopamine dependency. Third phase, accelerated intimacy through manufactured vulnerability. I shared fabricated childhood traumas, calibrated to echo her own experiences without overshadowing them. She believed she was witnessing my unprecedented openness. In reality, she was participating in a controlled psychological experiment. "You're the only one who really sees me," she told me one night, her head on my chest, the campus lake reflecting moonlight through my dorm window. I stroked her hair, thinking not of her words, but of the predictable neurochemical processes occurring in her brain. Oxytocin release, dopamine spike, the simple chemistry of attachment. Final phase, abrupt withdrawal. I stopped responding to texts, changed my routine to avoid her. When confronted, I displayed confusion at her emotional response. "I thought we were just having fun," I said, watching her psychological infrastructure collapse. I tracked her psychological breakdown like a scientist observes a rare specimen. Her pain was data, her suffering a fascinating research project. I noted her weight loss, the decline in academic performance, the social media posts oscillating between anger and depression. My roommate Derek confronted me. "Dude, Sarah's a mess. What did you do to her?" I maintained neutral affect. Relationships end, people move on. She's not eating, her friends are worried. An interesting variable, social support networks as mitigating factors in attachment severance. I made a mental note to isolate future subjects more effectively. 3 months later, Sarah transferred schools. A fascinating outcome. I filed the data away. Lesson learned: complete emotional investment from the subject creates maximum impact upon withdrawal. A successful experiment, yet something unexpected occurred. A minor anomaly in my own psychological state. Occasional intrusive thoughts about her absence. Not guilt, a useless emotion, perhaps a form of ownership response. The way one might miss a well-designed tool, nothing significant, a data point to monitor. Marketing wasn't just a career, it was an extension of my psychological toolkit. Understanding human desire, exploiting psychological vulnerabilities, creating narratives people would believe without questioning. Ogilvy and Reed hired me straight out of graduate school. My thesis on psychological triggers in consumer behavior impressed the creative director. "You don't just understand consumers," he said during my interview. "You dissect them." I rose quickly. My campaigns weren't creative in the traditional sense, they were psychological architecture. I built desire from the foundation of insecurity, created narratives that consumers didn't just believe, but internalized as their own thoughts. The Carson Pharmaceuticals campaign was my masterpiece. A medication for social anxiety that I positioned not as treatment, but as transformation. The tagline, "Become who you already are," was a psychological paradox that created both comfort and aspiration. Sales increased 340% in the first quarter. My colleagues found me difficult but brilliant. I cultivated an air of aloof genius, approachable enough to function in teams, distant enough to maintain mystique. Office relationships were strategic. I knew precisely which connections would advance my position, which rivals required neutralization, which superiors needed the illusion of mentoring a protege. Diana from Creative Services attempted friendship, coffee invitations, lunch suggestions. I accepted occasionally, providing calculated personal revelations that satisfied her curiosity without allowing actual intimacy. When she was diagnosed with breast cancer, I sent an appropriate arrangement of flowers, made a brief, perfectly timed hospital visit, displayed the exact degree of concern expected, no more, no less. My apartment in the city became my controlled environment. Minimalist design, neutral colors, no photographs, no memorabilia, no evidence of emotional history. Just clean lines and psychological space where nothing could attach itself to me. Women moved through my life in carefully managed intervals, never staying long enough to require significant psychological investment, never leaving abruptly enough to create disruption. I selected partners who presented interesting psychological variables: the high-achieving attorney with father issues, the artist with abandonment trauma, the emergency room doctor who couldn't save her sister. Each relationship was a controlled experiment. Women weren't partners, they were subjects. Research opportunities in the laboratory of human vulnerability. Elena Rodriguez became my most complex project. She wasn't a girlfriend. She was a full psychological landscape to be mapped and conquered. We met at an industry conference. Her presentation on behavioral economics revealed a mind that could almost match my own. Almost. She analyzed patterns. I engineered them. Our courtship was unlike previous experiments. She detected obvious manipulation, recognized standard psychological tactics. I needed to create a more sophisticated approach, a challenge I found strangely stimulating. I shared strategic fragments of vulnerability, just enough to seem authentic, never enough to be truly known. Each conversation was a carefully constructed maze, with me always holding the master key. 6 months in, she began staying regularly at my apartment. An unprecedented development. I permitted limited alterations to my space: a specific coffee mug, 3 books on my shelf, a throw blanket on my sofa. Controlled variables to create the illusion of integration while maintaining psychological distance. When she attempted genuine intimacy, I'd create scenarios that made her question her own perceptions. Gaslighting wasn't a technique. It was my architectural design of emotional self-preservation. "You never said you loved me," she accused once after I deliberately withheld the phrase following her own declaration. "I did," I insisted calmly. "Last night before you fell asleep." A fabrication delivered with perfect conviction. I watched doubt enter her expression, the recalibration of memory, the questioning of her own reality. "I must have been half asleep," she finally said. "I don't remember." I smiled, touched her face with calculated tenderness. "You were tired, it's fine." I systematically isolated her from her support network, not through aggression but through a masterful deconstruction of her social connections. A text here, a subtle suggestion there, until she was psychologically dependent on my validation. Her sister Camilla presented the greatest challenge. Their bond was unusual in its stability. During a dinner at her parents' home, Camilla watched me with undisguised suspicion. "You don't quite reach your eyes when you smile," she told me directly as we washed dishes, Elena in the other room. "I'm not sure what you mean," I replied, maintaining neutral affect. "I think you do." She handed me a plate to dry. "My sister thinks you're complex. I think you're empty." A fascinating assessment. Incorrect, but fascinating. I wasn't empty. I was in complete control of a psychological architecture others couldn't comprehend. I addressed the Camilla variable within 2 months. Casual mentions of her financial troubles to Elena. Subtle implications about reliability. When Camilla needed a significant loan, I ensured Elena questioned her motives. The fracture was hairline, but sufficient. Another successful adjustment to the experiment. But here's the brutal truth that even I struggle to admit. Every time I dismantled a potential connection, I was also demolishing a part of my own humanity. Piece by microscopic piece, the first evidence appeared during year 2 with Elena. An unexpected physiological response when she was hospitalized with appendicitis. Heart rate elevation, sleep disturbance, cognitive intrusions that didn't align with experimental protocols, concerning anomalies in my otherwise perfect system. More troubling was an uncharacteristic error. During her recovery, I brought her favorite flowers without experimental purpose, a genuine gesture without psychological calculation. When I realized the deviation, I implemented immediate corrective measures, created an artificial conflict, restored emotional distance. Elena didn't survive the relationship intact. Few experimental subjects did. When I ended our connection, she didn't understand the methodical deconstruction that had occurred. Couldn't comprehend that her emotional collapse wasn't love. It was engineered dependency systematically withdrawn. The night she moved out, rain lashed against my windows. She stood in my doorway, one final box in her arms. "There's something wrong with you," she said quietly. "Not broken. Wrong. Like you're missing something essential to being human." I maintained neutral affect until the door closed, filed away her assessment as subject bias. Yet that night, an unprecedented event occurred. A momentary perception of emptiness in my perfectly controlled environment. The absence of her coffee mug, the removed books on my shelf, the missing throw blanket. Not loss. I didn't experience loss, just a clinical observation of altered space. Nothing significant, a minor data point, nothing more. Dr. Reyes was different. A therapist who didn't try to fix me but simply witnessed. I didn't seek therapy voluntarily. The new CMO at the agency mandated psychological evaluation after I reduced an account executive to tears during a presentation. An overreaction to incompetence, a rare lapse in my emotional control systems. I selected Dr. Maria Reyes based on credentials. Harvard-trained. Psychodynamic approach with cognitive behavioral influences. I anticipated standard therapeutic protocols. I prepared counter-strategies for traditional psychological assessment techniques. Her office defied expectation. No couch, no desk creating power distance. 2 chairs positioned at a precise angle. Close enough for observation, far enough for psychological comfort. Her design sensibility indicated understanding of spatial psychology. "Why are you here, Adrian?" Her first question, direct, unadorned. "Mandatory evaluation," I replied. "Factual, unemotional." "That explains your presence, not your purpose." An unexpected distinction, I recalibrated. Professional development requires periodic self-assessment. She observed me silently. Different from my subjects. She wasn't attempting to understand for connection. She was analyzing with detached precision that mirrored my own methodology. "You construct rather than communicate," she finally said. "Interesting choice." For the first time, someone mapped my emotional terrain without attempting to colonize it. And that was more terrifying than any potential emotional invasion. Our sessions continued weekly, then twice weekly. An unusual development that I rationalized as professional curiosity. Dr. Reyes didn't attempt standard therapeutic interventions. She constructed a psychological mirror, reflecting my own mechanisms back with disturbing clarity. "Your relationships," she noted in our 4th session, "you describe them as case studies, not experiences." "I find analytical frameworks more useful than emotional narratives," I replied. "Useful for what purpose?" The question lingered between us. I had no prepared response. In our 7th session, she introduced an unusual technique. "Describe your mother without analyzing her." A simple request. Impossibly difficult to execute. Every description became psychological assessment. Every memory filtered through analytical frameworks. "Just the sensory experience," she guided. "What did she smell like?" I started to explain her psychological approach to personal grooming, then stopped myself. Accessed a different type of memory. "Lancôme perfume," I said finally, "and hospital antiseptic." She was a surgical nurse. Dr. Reyes nodded. The sound of her voice? Low, controlled, minimal vocal variation. I paused, accessing an unexpected memory. Except when she sang, in the car sometimes, when she thought I was asleep. A revelation that disturbed me. A detail without psychological utility. A memory preserved without analytical purpose. By our 12th session, I recognized a concerning pattern. Increased emotional permeability. Decreased analytical distance. Dr. Reyes wasn't treating me. She was deconstructing my defensive architecture without providing replacement structures. "What are you doing?" I asked directly during session 15. "Witnessing," she replied. "To what end?" "That's your question to answer, Adrian." I decided to conduct my most dangerous experiment yet. A comprehensive confrontation with every individual I had manipulated. Not for redemption, not for forgiveness, for understanding. Dr. Reyes neither encouraged nor discouraged this plan. "What do you hope to discover?" she asked. "Empirical data on long-term effects of relationship termination methodologies," I replied automatically. Then revised, "I want to understand what I've done." Her expression didn't change, but she nodded slightly. That's different from your usual approach. How so? You're seeking knowledge without predetermined analytical framework. A disturbing observation, accurate but disturbing. Healing isn't a destination, it's a war zone where your worst enemy is yourself. Dr. Reyes called it confronting the internal narrative. I called it psychological warfare. The first time I sat in her office, I was a perfectly constructed algorithm. Every response calculated, every emotion strategically filtered. Tell me about your childhood, she said. Simple words, loaded like a weapon. I didn't tell her stories. I presented case studies, clinical, detached, a dissertation on emotional survival. She saw through me instantly. Not with pity, not with judgment, but with a clinical precision that rivaled my own psychological defenses. Vulnerability isn't a weakness. It's a battlefield where every emotional memory is a landmine. My childhood wasn't tragic. It was a systematic deconstruction of emotional connection. My mother, a master of emotional withdrawal. My father, an absence so profound it became a presence. I learned early that love is a transaction. Affection, a negotiable currency. Trust, a luxury I couldn't afford. Finding Sarah Thompson required minimal effort. Social media digital footprints are remarkably persistent. She had married, relocated to Boston, worked as a clinical psychologist, specialized in trauma recovery, an interesting career trajectory potentially influenced by our interaction. The coffee shop I selected was neutral territory. Public enough for safety, private enough for conversation. I arrived early, calibrated my psychological state to project appropriate levels of contrition without emotional excess. She entered precisely on time, physically altered from my memory. Shorter hair, professional attire, the same nervous gesture of touching her necklace that I had documented years earlier. Recognition crossed her features, then something unexpected. Not fear, not anger, weariness. She sat across from me. Adrian, it's been a long time. 12 years, 4 months, I said, then recognized the inappropriate precision. Approximately. Why am I here? Direct question. I had prepared multiple response strategies, selected the most straightforward. I'm contacting people from my past, people I treated poorly. You mean people you manipulated and discarded? No emotional inflection, a clinical assessment. Similar to my own communication style. Fascinating adaptation. Yes, I acknowledged, that would be accurate. And what do you want from me? Forgiveness? Closure? Some kind of emotional absolution? I considered my actual objective. Realized I hadn't defined it with my usual precision. I want to understand the impact of my behavior. From your perspective? She studied me for 7.2 seconds. Sipped her coffee before responding. You nearly destroyed me. Not because I loved you so deeply, but because you made me question my own perceptions, my own worth, my own sanity. She leaned forward. Do you understand the difference? I didn't. A rare acknowledgement of intellectual limitation. Breaking a heart is painful but straightforward, she continued. Breaking someone's trust in their own reality, that's violence on another level. Violence, I repeated, an unexpected categorization of my methodology. Yes, Adrian, violence. She placed her cup down precisely. I spent 3 years in therapy, changed universities, rebuilt my understanding of relationships from the foundation. Not because of heartbreak, because you systematically dismantled my sense of self to prove you could. An accurate assessment of my experimental objective. Uncomfortable to have it articulated. I'm sorry, I said, testing the words, finding them inadequate. I don't need your apology, Sarah said. I resolved this years ago. My question is, why are you really doing this? I provided the explanation I had constructed. I'm reassessing past behaviors, attempting to understand their consequences. Bullshit. She smiled slightly. You're still talking about human emotion like it's a research project. What changed, Adrian? What cracked your perfect system? An unsettlingly perceptive question. I considered deflection, then opted for limited disclosure. I'm experiencing inconsistencies in my psychological architecture. You mean you're feeling things and it scares the hell out of you? She laughed softly. Welcome to humanity, Adrian. It's terrifying for all of us. Our meeting concluded after 47 minutes. As she prepared to leave, she delivered a final observation. You know what's interesting? I became a psychologist because of you. Understanding what you did to me helped me help others. Your damage became my purpose. She gathered her belongings. Maybe there's a lesson there. I watched her exit the cafe, noted an unexpected physiological response. Elevated heart rate, minor throat constriction, unproductive emotional data that I filed away for later analysis. Elena proved more difficult to contact. She had implemented comprehensive digital privacy measures. An interesting response to our relationship. I located her through professional channels. She had become a respected behavioral economist, published research on coercive relationship dynamics. Another career potentially influenced by our interaction. She declined meeting in person. Suggested video call instead. Control of environment, psychological distance. Tactical decisions I recognized from my own methodology. When her image appeared on screen, I experienced an unexpected physiological response. Cardiac rhythm disruption. Momentary respiratory irregularity. Concerning symptoms requiring further analysis. Adrian. Her greeting was neutral. Her office visible behind her. Bookshelves, academic credentials framed on walls. A deliberately professional presentation. "Thank you for speaking with me," I began. "I admit I'm curious about your purpose," she interrupted. "You never did anything without multiple layers of motivation." Accurate assessment. I provided the same explanation given to Sarah. Elena's response was different, more analytical. "Interesting," she said. "So you're experiencing what? Guilt, remorse, or just collecting data on the aftermath of your psychological experiments?" "I'm not certain," I admitted. "A rare acknowledgement of internal ambiguity. That's new for you." She studied me through the screen. "You know, after you, I researched psychological manipulation extensively, wrote my dissertation on it. Your techniques were textbook, isolation, reality distortion, intermittent reinforcement." "Yes," I acknowledged. "But here's what fascinated me," she continued. "These tactics require complete emotional detachment from the manipulator. True sociopaths can maintain that indefinitely. But you slipped occasionally, showed genuine reaction, which means you weren't a sociopath, just someone with extraordinary emotional suppression capabilities." A disturbingly insightful analysis. I maintained neutral expression while processing her assessment. "My conclusion," Elena said, "was that something happened to you. Something that made emotional detachment a survival mechanism so necessary that you elevated it to an art form." Dr. Reyes had suggested similar hypotheses. I had dismissed them as conventional therapeutic frameworks. Hearing it from Elena created uncomfortable cognitive dissonance. "Why contact me now, Adrian? What changed?" I considered deflection, considered terminating the conversation. Instead, I offered unprecedented disclosure. "I'm experiencing system failure, emotional intrusions, memory disruptions, attachment responses without tactical purpose." She nodded slowly. "You're breaking down, or maybe breaking through. I don't understand the distinction." "I know," she said. "That's the problem." Our conversation continued 34 minutes. Before disconnecting, she offered a final observation. "You know what's sad, Adrian? There were moments, brief ones, when I think you actually were present, actually felt something real. But you always shut it down immediately, always retreated to your controlled environment." "Which moments?" I asked, experiencing unexpected urgency for this data. "That's for you to figure out," she said and ended the call. That night, I experienced severe sleep disruption. Intrusive thoughts, memory fragments without analytical context. Dr. Reyes had warned me that confronting past behaviors might destabilize my psychological defenses. I hadn't anticipated the severity of the response. The following morning, I called the office, requested emergency session. Dr. Reyes accommodated immediately. When I arrived, she observed my physical presentation without comment. I belatedly realized I'd failed to implement standard grooming protocols, hadn't shaved, wore mismatched clothing items, visible evidence of psychological disorganization. "Tell me what happened," she said simply. I provided detailed account of both conversations, the physiological responses, the cognitive disruptions, the sleep disturbance. She listened without interruption. "What am I experiencing?" I asked finally. "Emotional integration," she replied. "Your compartmentalization system is failing." "How do I repair it?" "You don't," she said. "You learn to function without it." An unacceptable proposition. "That's not possible." "It's necessary," she countered. "Your defense mechanisms are destroying you, Adrian. They're just doing it slowly enough that you haven't noticed." Dr. Reyes didn't try to heal. She forced me to recognize the machinery of my own psychological protection. "Your manipulation," she'd say, "is a sophisticated defense mechanism, not a personality. Easy to say, impossible to dismantle." I realized my entire life was an elaborate performance. A one-man show where I was simultaneously the actor, director, and most brutal critic. After 6 months of intensive therapy, Dr. Reyes prescribed an unorthodox intervention. "I want you to visit your mother. I had maintained minimal contact, annual phone calls, occasional emails, sufficient to prevent complete severance but insufficient for meaningful connection. Carefully calibrated distance. For what purpose, I asked? To observe her without your childhood defensive filters. To see her as she is now, not as the architect of your emotional suppression. The prospect created significant psychological resistance. I constructed multiple rational objections. Dr. Reyes acknowledged each one, then repeated her recommendation. My mother had relocated to a smaller house after retirement, downsized her life with the same efficiency she'd applied to erasing my father. When I arrived, she displayed standard maternal behaviors, prepared coffee, asked appropriate questions about my professional status, maintained emotional distance. I observed her with new analytical frameworks, noted the precision of her movements, the absence of spontaneity, the controlled emotional presentation identical to my own methodology. "Why did you want to visit?" she asked directly. Suspicious of deviations from established interaction patterns, I considered fabricating a pragmatic explanation, instead implemented Dr. Reyes's recommended approach. "I'm trying to understand our relationship better." She placed her coffee cup down with mathematical precision. "What's to understand? I raised you. You became successful." "We never discuss emotional content," I observed. "Emotions are private matters," she replied automatically. Then, unexpectedly, "Is this about your father?" A surprising introduction of previously prohibited subject matter. I maintained neutral affect while experiencing internal disruption. "In part, perhaps." She smoothed her napkin with unnecessary attention. "Your father was weak, emotionally undisciplined. I protected you from that influence." An extraordinary statement. I processed its implications. "You believe emotional attachment is weakness. I believe emotional dependency is vulnerability," she corrected. "I taught you self-sufficiency." "You taught me emotional isolation," I said. The words emerged without tactical planning. An unprecedented confrontational approach. She didn't display anger. Her expression reflected something more disturbing. Recognition. "I taught you survival," she said quietly, "the same way my mother taught me." Intergenerational transmission of attachment disorder. A clinical concept I had studied but never applied to my own psychological architecture. The realization created cognitive dissonance I struggled to process. "We're the same, Adrian," she continued. "We observe, we analyze, we maintain control." "And we're alone," I added, testing the concept verbally. She met my eyes directly. For the first time, I recognized fear beneath her perfect composure. Better alone than vulnerable. I understood then, not just intellectually, a deeper recognition that bypassed analytical frameworks. My mother wasn't cruel, she was damaged, perpetuating the only attachment model she knew. The realization didn't create forgiveness, it created context. When I reported this interaction to Dr. Reyes, she asked a single question. "Do you want to continue her legacy?" The question remained unanswered. Unlearning is more painful than learning. Every relationship I'd destroyed, every emotional connection I'd sabotaged. They weren't just actions, they were survival strategies embedded in my neural pathways. I began to understand the difference between protection and isolation, between self-preservation and self-destruction. But understanding? Understanding is a knife's edge between insight and breakdown. Dr. Reyes proposed an experiment, radical in its simplicity, terrifying in its implications. "Feel the emotion," she'd say. "Don't analyze it, experience it." I started a journal, not a clinical log, a raw, unfiltered documentation of my emotional landscape. Each entry was like performing emotional surgery on myself, without anesthesia, without mercy. Entry 12. Today I experienced what Dr. R identifies as grief. Not categorized, not labeled in the moment. Just a physical sensation of hollowness when I saw a father and son in the park. The boy was explaining something with excessive animation. The father was fully attentive. I had the thought, I never experienced that. Followed by physiological response, throat constriction, eye moisture, chest pressure. Allowed the sensation to continue without suppression for 3 minutes. 42 sec before system. Override engaged. Progress from previous tolerance threshold of 1:17 sec. Entry 27. Dr. R instructed me to revisit locations from significant relationships. Went to the lake where Sarah and I had often walked. Unexpected memory intrusion, her laughter during rainfall. We had no umbrella. She pulled me under a tree, said, "Some things are worth getting wet for." At the time I categorized it as a rational risk assessment. Today I recognized it as joy. Simple human joy I was incapable of sharing. Experienced significant physiological response. Did not suppress. Duration 7:22 sec. Entry 43. Elena's painting still hangs in my hallway. Only personal artifact in the apartment. Have looked at it daily without seeing it. Today stopped and observed properly. Recalled her concentration when creating it. Small vertical line between her eyebrows. Total absorption in the process. She existed completely in that moment. I never existed completely in any moment. Always observing, analyzing, planning the next psychological move. What would it feel like to be fully present? Is that possible for me? Healing isn't linear. It's a series of controlled demolitions. I discovered that my fear of abandonment was more complex than a childhood narrative. It was a sophisticated ecosystem of defense mechanisms. Every breakthrough felt like a betrayal to the version of myself I'd meticulously constructed. The most terrifying moment? Realizing that my greatest manipulation had always been against myself. Dr. Reyes increased our sessions to 3 times weekly. The psychological restructuring created destabilization that required constant monitoring. I experienced episodes of dissociation, panic responses, memory floods that disrupted cognitive functioning. This is normal, she assured me. Your psychological architecture is reorganizing. It's unbearable, I admitted. An unprecedented acknowledgement of limitation. Yes, she agreed simply, it is. 18 months into treatment, I experienced a catastrophic system failure, triggered by incidental observation. A mother ignoring her child's attempt to show her a drawing. In a cafe, mundane scene. Should have been irrelevant data, instead total emotional collapse. Public setting, uncontrollable physiological response. Respiratory distress, vision impairment, consciousness disruption. Dr. Reyes classified it as emotional flashback. A trauma response. I rejected the terminology. Trauma was for victims. I was an architect, not a casualty. Your defenses are breaking down, she explained. The emotions you've contained your entire life are emerging simultaneously. How do I restore control? I demanded. You don't, she said.